It was one of those bitterly cold mornings. The kind of cold where your breath turns to fog as soon as you step outside. And if you're anything like me, you know what comes next. Staring at those overwhelming heating bills that make you wonder if you're just heating the air. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. My friend Sarah invited me to visit her Amish relatives, and today was the day. We pulled up to the farm, and immediately I noticed something that felt different from what I'm used to. No sound of cars or power lines. Just the crunch of snow beneath our boots and the sound of a horse-drawn buggy in the distance. It felt almost like time had slowed down. Sarah's cousins Emma and Daniel greeted us warmly at the door. Their house looked simple but cozy, and I couldn't help but notice how warm it felt inside despite the cold outside. I was dying to know their secret. I asked Emma, "How do you stay so warm in here without using electricity or gas?" She smiled, as if it was something they did every day without thinking twice. "You'll see," she said, and with that, we started the tour. Emma led me to the living room, and there it was, a big black wood-burning stove sitting proudly in the corner. I could feel the heat radiating from it even before I got close. This stove wasn't just for show. It was the main source of heat for the entire room. "This stove does it all," Emma explained. "It heats the room, cooks our food, and even boils water for washing dishes or making tea. We don't need anything else." I was impressed. I always thought wood stoves were just for burning firewood, but this one seemed to be doing all the heavy lifting. She showed me how they had a stack of firewood outside, neatly piled and covered to keep it dry. "The key is dry wood," she said. "Wet wood won't burn well and gives off too much smoke." I had never really thought about how the quality of the wood could affect the heat, but after hearing Emma's explanation, it made perfect sense. After checking out the stove, Emma led me to the windows. I was surprised to see how thick the walls of the house were. The Amish don't use modern insulation like we do, but they've learned how to make the most of natural materials. "These walls are made with thick timber and straw to keep the cold out," Emma told me. "The thicker the walls, the less heat escapes." I couldn't help but compare it to my house, where I could feel drafts around the windows no matter how much I cranked up the heat. Emma showed me the heavy curtains they use, too. "In winter, we hang these over the windows at night to keep the heat inside," she said. She also pointed out how the windows were made of thick glass, which kept more heat in than the thin glass I had in my own home. I had never really thought about how much heat escapes through poorly insulated windows, but after seeing this, I knew it was something I needed to address in my own house. As we moved through the house, I noticed something that I hadn't thought of before. The Amish focus their heat where it's needed most. In the living room, the stove was doing its job perfectly, but the other rooms were cooler. "We don't try to heat every room," Emma explained. "We keep the living areas warm and use thick blankets in the bedrooms. The goal is comfort, not heat everywhere." That made so much sense to me. I tend to try and heat every room in my house, even the ones I don't use much, just because it's easy to turn up the thermostat and forget about it. Emma showed me how they even kept the doors to unused rooms closed during the winter. This helped them keep the warm air in the rooms they use most. Next, Emma led me to the ceiling, where she pointed out a small vent above the stove. "This vent helps send heat upstairs," she explained. I had never thought about how warm air rises and how you could take advantage of it. In my house, I just leave the heat running in every room, hoping it would get warm enough. But Emma's approach was different. By using that vent and focusing heat on the areas that mattered most, they didn't have to waste energy on rooms they weren't using. She also showed me a small metal fan on top of the stove. It was powered by the heat from the stove itself. No electricity required. It spun gently, pushing warm air into the room. This fan helps circulate the heat, so we get more out of the stove without using any extra energy, Emma said. I was blown away. I had no idea you could use simple tools like this to make your heat go further. After spending some time in the living room, we went to the kitchen. Emma pointed out some reflective panels she had set up in front of the windows. On sunny days, we use these panels to reflect the sunlight inside. The sun gives off heat, and we try to capture as much of it as we can. I wasn't sure what she meant until I saw it. The panels were just sheets of aluminum foil, placed carefully to direct the sunlight into the kitchen. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. Emma explained that they try to use natural light as much as possible. On bright days, the sunlight heats the room for us. We just have to be smart about where we place things. I was amazed by how they use the sun's natural warmth to save on heating. It was such a simple and sustainable approach. At this point, I was starting to realize that the Amish way of doing things wasn't about buying expensive gadgets or relying on modern technology. It was about using what you have and being clever with it. Emma showed me how they layered up in the winter. We wear lots of layers to stay warm, especially at night. You don't need a heated blanket when you've got wool socks and a thick sweater. I laughed as she pulled out an old, cozy quilt from the couch. We have blankets everywhere, she said, and we keep a few extra on hand for when guests visit. I couldn't help but think about how many times I had cranked up the heat just to get comfortable, even when it was only a little chilly. The Amish had figured out that staying warm was just about managing your environment and dressing smartly. After spending a full day at Emma and Daniel's house, I realized something important. The Amish aren't doing anything complicated. They're just using old-school methods that work. From the stove to the insulation, everything was about efficiency. What struck me the most was how they didn't waste energy. They didn't rely on gadgets, apps, or modern technology. They used what nature gave them, wood, sun, and their own two hands, and made it work for them. It made me think about my own house. I don't have a wood stove, but I could still learn a lot from how Emma and Daniel lived. I could insulate better, use curtains to keep the heat in, and be more intentional about where I use heat in my home. Emma's tips were simple but so effective. Use a wood stove or a similar heat source. Insulate well and use heavy curtains. Don't try to heat the whole house. Focus on the rooms you use most. Capture natural heat from the sun. Layer up and use blankets instead of cranking up the heat.